Give me the Bible, star of gladness gleaming, to cheer the wanderer lone and tempest-tossed. No storms can hide that radiance peaceful beaming, since Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Long with the Ruston Church of Christ, and we are very thankful that you joined us for a little Bible study. We're going to look at Joshua chapters 9 through 12. We have in our Bible classes been walking through the book of Joshua before we started to our summer classes. We wanted to look at God's people under a new young ruler, and so we have been going through the book of Joshua, and now we are to the point in Joshua's chapter 9 through 12 that the Israelite people have already had two battles. They had a battle at Jericho where God went before the people and gave them some specific instructions for them to be passive, and Jericho fell easily because they followed God's command. And then one of the Israelite people took something from Jericho, one of the accursed things as they're called, and the next time they went into battle, they had a terrible defeat in a battle they should have easily won. And God is instructing them and demonstrating to them that if you want to win, if you want to find success, you need to follow me. And so here we are in chapters 9 through 12, and the message is going to pick up pretty quick after chapter 9. In chapter 10, it really takes off in chapters 10 and 11 and runs through the conquering of the majority of Canaan in a relatively short time period. But I hope you're here with us, that you maybe brought your Bible and that you want to learn about these things, or that they're helpful to you in understanding what happened and some of the lessons we can draw from the book of Joshua. So in chapter 9 is where we are picking up now. It says that it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, on this side, the side that they crossed to, that whenever they heard about that, it says that the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite, they heard about it, that they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors. And so right off the bat, you see there are two responses. God has given miraculous victories to the Israelites, and you have this alliance of kings that starts to form as these wicked kings start to join together, because even though they are afraid, and even though that they know that there is God is going before them and causing them to win these battles, out of their fear they react and they start getting ready for war. But then you have those Gibeonites, I almost said Moabites, those Gibeonites that decide that they are going to trick the Israelite people into entering a pact with them. And so what the rest of this chapter details is that they came up with a plan, and they put on old sandals that were torn up and worn out and dry, and they took busted, dried old wineskins and old clothes, and they did all this stuff to make themselves look like they had been traveling for a really long time. They brought stale bread, and they come and they present themselves to the Israelite people, and they tell them that we have journeyed from far away and that we want to enter an alliance with you because we've heard of your God and we know who he is. And they kind of question them a little bit. They tell them, look at our sandals and look at our stale bread. This was hot whenever we took it. They just lied, and they told them we are from a far off country. And without consulting the Lord, in verse 14 says, the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not counsel of the Lord. And then verse 15, so Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them. And well, the big problem with this is whenever the Israelite people were leaving in Exodus chapter 23, they were getting ready to enter into Canaan. They were instructed to make no covenant with the people that live in that land. But because they were tricked into thinking they weren't from that land, they were from a far off land, they went ahead and entered into a covenant, but they did it without consulting God. So again, we see them, they're not following, they're not walking in wisdom and following what God would want them to do. And we see that these Gibeonites are tricked them and successfully have them enter into a covenant with them. And then it says that after a few days, they realized that they were their neighbors, that wherever they were staying, they lived just in the next town over. And they realized who they were, and they're angry and they're upset and they want to do something about it. But Joshua instructs the elders and tells them that we can't do anything about this. We have entered into a covenant with them. Whether the covenant was right or wrong, we have entered a covenant with them, and we are not going to break that covenant. And so as a form of a punishment, they were going to work as slaves. They were going to be carriers of wood and water and serve for the Israelite people, and especially in the service of the tabernacle. And so they were going to be slaves. And the Gibeonites were actually more than happy to do that. In verse 23 it says, I'm sorry, that was whenever Joshua curses them. But at the end of the chapter, at verse 25, when they're upset and they're telling them about all the things telling them how they were deceived, in verse 25, it says, "And now here we are in your hands. Do with us as it seems good and right to do to us." It says, so Joshua made them slaves, but did not kill them. In verse 27, "And that day he made them woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation of the altar of the Lord." And it says that they still do that even to this day at the time that he wrote this. Two things that I really think are really important to notice is that the Israelite people quit walking in faith and they started to walk by sight. They looked at the sandals, they looked old. They looked at their clothes, they looked worn. They held the bread, it was stale. Everything about that, everything that their sight showed them said that they were telling the truth. But they didn't consult with God, they were deceived. Versus the Gibeonites walked in faith. It says that right there in verse 3, "But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and started on a plan." They feared God. They feared what he could do through the Israelite nation. And so they did whatever it took for them to be protected and enter a covenant with these people. And so we see the results. When we walk by faith, we can be in covenant with God. But when we walk by sight, we are going to fall outside of the will of God. And so that's what chapter 9 is all about. And then chapter 10, it kind of resumes those kings that had come together. They heard that the Gibeonites had made a pact with Israel. And it says that they feared greatly, chapter 10 and verse 2, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. And they're afraid. And what they do is they make a pact, and they all get together, and they say, we're going to attack Gibeon, try to knock out that weaker link, because we don't think we can take out Israel and Gibeon together, but Israel has the Lord. So they go and they attack Gibeon, and they end up doing that, and the Gibeonites call out to the Israelites. They come and they fight for them, and they protect them. And actually on that day, verse 11 through 13, that it says that God fought for them, that they routed the people, and then God killed them and chased them along with stones. Oh, I'm sorry. That was verse 10. Verse 11, it says that the Lord rained down large hailstones from heaven and killed more than all of the Israelites killed. And then verse 12, that Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered the Amorites before the children of Israel, and he cried for the sun to stand still, so that until they were done slaughtering the Amorites. And it says in verse 13 that that's exactly what happened. And then in verse 14 that there's never been a day like that again where God listened to the voice of a man. And so we see Joshua and Israel walking with God, doing what God wants, and God fighting with them. Verse 14, God fought for Israel. And when we look at this story, there's a few things that I see here too. In verse 2, they feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city and was great and they were mighty. And so they all got together and they reacted. They lashed out. Wickedness, when it becomes afraid, lashes out. We will be upset at something, or something happened to us that we don't like or makes us afraid. And if we're not careful, we will lash out in anger and violence. Righteousness and patience doesn't do that. It's the fear of wickedness that does that. And so what ends up happening is God and Israel, they destroy these 5 kings, and they hid the kings in a cave, and then they went out and they slaughtered the rest of the people. And while they were doing that, after it was all said and done, they pulled the 5 kings out. And in verse 24, Joshua calls for the captains of Israel, and he says, "Come near and put your feet on the necks of these kings." And they drew near and they put their feet on their necks. And it says that they slew them with their feet on their necks, and then they hung them in a tree until that evening. And if you remember the story of Genesis, the promise that was made, or maybe we should rather say the curse, it was still a promise that was made to the serpent for deceiving and causing sin, was that his seed, he shall bruise the heel of woman's seed, who would bruise his head. I think Joshua knew that story well. And so as he's slaying the kings of wickedness, he lays his feet on their heads as they kill them. And so we have this picture of what it means when God overcomes evil. And so chapter 10 concludes. It's them conquering southern Canaan. And then you get to chapter 11, and they go into the north, and they're conquering the northern side of Canaan. And you can come all the way down to verse 19. It says, "There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All the others they took in battle." I think there's something there that no one else tried to make peace. No one tried to have a covenant, even though the Israelite people were instructed not to make any covenants, not to make any agreements with them. Nobody else even tried. And I think this speaks a little bit to the providence of God, why he sent judgment on this nation, why he gave the Israelite nation the commandments to destroy them to the end, is that none of them were going to respond to reason, or were going to respond even when they saw the power of God working right in front of them. And so nobody made peace except for the Gibeonites. And if you look at that, no one had the faith to trust in God and to try to surrender to him, but everyone who did was saved. Rahab the prostitute was saved, and the Gibeonites were saved. And so we see that. And so chapter 10 is them conquering the southern kingdom. Chapter 11 is them conquering the northern kingdom. And then in chapter 12, you kind of get this boring list that's here, and it's all of the kings and all of the battles, and where they happened, and who the kings were that were defeated. And for you and I, this may be something that we try to drift off to sleep to if we tried to read it, but it was an important historical record that God was keeping his promise that the Israelite nation would conquer the land. And it says that Joshua did this, and that he was conquering quickly, and that he continued to possess all of the land, and that he made war a long time with those kings, chapter 11 and verse 18. And we see God keeping his promises to his people. And for you and I, God is going to keep his promises with us. But when we walk in faith, not when we walk by sight, when we surrender and submit to him, not when we react and we rebel and we lash out, but when we submit ourselves in fear to him, then God is going to fight for us, and we're going to find victory. I hope that you look through this conquering of Israel, and that it's beneficial to you. I love the imagery that connects the entire Bible story from Genesis all the way to the coming of Christ, and the fulfillment that we're going to find when God brings his holy city to be with us once again. The Bible is one giant picture that talks about the glory of God and the reconciling of man to him. I hope this has been useful for you. If you like our videos, think about subscribing or at least hitting that like button. It's free to you. It means a lot to us. Or share this video if you thought it was worth sharing. We really appreciate you. We hope you'll join with us the next time we have a study.